Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me this morning at WPPI. My name is Anabel Dflux. I am a Sigma ambassador, and I'm very excited to present on how to make your portrait photography just a little bit more creative. So a lot of what I do in my photography work is in camera. For the most part, the only type of retouching that I do is just color correction, because I believe that the more that you get in your camera, the less time you're spending on the computer and the more time you are spending out there shooting. So I'm just going to chat a little bit about a few tips on how to add a little bit more to your portrait photography and to make it interesting for your clients and for all the people that are looking at your images. So the place that I always start with my portrait photography, whether I'm doing band promos or I'm shooting just client sessions or doing something more fantasy-esque, is to find that little spark of inspiration. So I'll usually just find something in the actual world or in a movie or a film or some sort of media that I find to be very interesting and creative. And through that, I will find a way to take that idea and make it into something tangible, whether it's putting a character into a setting or just having a kooky idea and finding a studio that is able to incorporate my plan. For example, you can use recognizable characters such as these two cosplay models who are playing villains from the DC universe. And for me, the easiest way to make this into a very creative type of portrait is to find a home for these characters. This was shot here in Las Vegas in the Arts District area, because the first thing I thought of is that these characters need to go somewhere a little bit more industrial, a little bit more rugged. You don't have to go very crazy or over the top with it, because I find that the subjects that you are capturing is the interesting part of your image. So what I wanted to do here was just ground those characters and find a home for them. Likewise, if you don't even have a character, but you just have an idea, you can always figure out a way to make that happen. This is a pop singer named Amy Saturn who wanted to do a rain shoot, but this was over in Los Angeles when I used to live there, and if anyone has been to California, you know it doesn't rain very often, does it? So we had to figure out a way to make this happen, and again, trying to keep it as simple as possible, we managed to find a studio that has a rain room. It's just on a totally black backdrop. It's like a little shower that just goes right over your subject, and that's all we did. We could have made it, get a little bigger by adding a bunch of props or a bunch of sets and all that, but you know what? That, in my opinion, would take away from the subject. So all we did was find a totally black room, get some water, have her with an umbrella because we don't want her completely soaked, even though she ended up totally soaked anyways. And that's all we had to do. Honestly, this shoot only took about 10 minutes. That's all you need. The way that I see it is that creative photography doesn't have to be terribly over the top. Sometimes the simplest idea is the one that translates in your image the best. But, of course, as I'm talking about simplicity, a lot of it is the styling. What I mean by styling is it's the way that your subject is dressed. It's the couple of props you put in their hand. All of that brings about more creative looking images without having to do any sort of really crazy effort of building an entire set that might just take away from your subject rather than adding to the image itself. For example, these are promotional images for a designer that makes head crowns. And what I was looking for in styling here was that, of course, the fantasy element is the way that the model is dressed. And notice that there's really nothing else added to these shots. We did get very lucky driving around looking for parks in which we found a burned down tree that has not fully recovered from the fires. And that tree itself actually mimicked a lot of the way that the horns would flow. So we used that tree as kind of leading lines for this shot. And the only editing that was done here was color correction. What I did here was just boost the colors a little bit more because, again, creativity also goes back to the way that your audience views the shot itself. And sometimes just boosting the colors a wee little bit is all that image needs for an extra edge. And as well as that, I am using shallow depth of field lenses, especially in the shot that's coming up. And the reason that I choose shallow depth of field lenses for creative portrait photography is because if you think about what a shallow depth of field lens looks like, it's something that the human eye can't see. Immediately, the easiest way to make your images creative is to create something that we just don't see with our natural eye, or something that we don't see all the time. And having a very, very shallow depth of field look in the background, having everything kind of blur off into the bokeh, is something that the human eye does not naturally see every day. And as well as that, it's kind of taking a little bit from cinema. If you watch any sort of movie that is trying to emphasize a mystical or dreamlike state, they're usually using shallow depth of field. And for a shot such as this, my favorite lenses are, say, Sigma 35mm f1.2, which is like the shallowest depth of field you can find in an autofocus lens. It creates the most dreamlike images, as well as other lenses such as the 35 1.4 for the DSLR users, the 85 1.4, which creates really beautiful subject compression. Basically, prime lenses that have very, very shallow depths of field. And likewise, you can incorporate a lot of those ideas for just your regular client sessions. This was a shoot for this lovely girl who wanted to have a little bit of family portraits of herself matching with her dogs. And the only thing we had to do here was add some flower crowns and a few little itty bitty props. And that automatically elevates that image into something that you don't necessarily see every day. And yeah, she spent a couple of weeks training her dogs to hold the crowns on their head. And it was well worth it. And these were actually shot with the 85mm 1.4. Again, you can see the shallow depth of field kind of isolating that subject, pushing them out to the front while creating an image that the human eye does not see every single day. And as well, sometimes your props don't even have to be flower crowns. All we did was a little bit of a smoke machine that was then tinted into a specific color in post-processing, and that was it. You could immediately tell that it's a bit of a witchier image. My subject wanted something that looked a little bit more Halloween-esque because it was shot in the October month. And as for the location, since at the time I was living in Southern California and we were very well known for wildfires, if you go back to the fields after everything is safe and sound, it takes nature quite a while to recover. So we actually took advantage of that. I tried to create a little bit of a beauty into something that was so negative to begin with. And it created a wonderful backdrop that didn't require a whole lot. Again, if you can see the theme, it's kind of keep it simple and something that is very easy to read for your audience, because if you make it complicated, your audience will start getting a little bit overwhelmed to an extent in your images and kind of miss some of the main point. And as I was talking about that burned field, we go into location. I use the location truly to ground my subjects, to give them a home for whatever character they have invented, or if that character is actually themselves, and allow that location to kind of transport whoever is looking at your image exactly where you want them to go. For example, for this cosplay session, we needed something that was a little bit more green, a little bit more woodsy. Believe it or not, this was shot in Las Vegas, so we do have greenery and woodsiness here, in small doses, of course. But it's more than enough to ground this elven character into the shot. And once more, shallow depth of field in the portrait, pushes everything out front, separates everything. While the background in this particular shot was an important part of it, so that was shot with an f2. But you can see it is grounding the subject and making them have a home in the images that you create. Likewise, you can find unique locations that work with what the subject is wearing. So in this case, this was shot in Los Angeles with some very interesting architectural elements for a fashion shoot with a dress that had very interesting architectural elements with it. And when I was posing the subject to kind of fit into the location, you can see that all the leading lines are pushing up. So therefore, stretching your subject up to kind of match the location that they are sitting in was the way to go here. So before I do photo shoots, whenever, again, I get that little spark of inspiration and idea, whether it's from the clothing or something that I have seen, I'm immediately going out to scout locations that could ground my subject the best, plop them over there, have them posed in a way that kind of matches the location that you are capturing them in, and that's really all you need. And once more, not a whole lot else going on here other than model, dress, location. As well as that, using lenses to add a little bit of an edge to your shot also works out great for creative portrait photography. This was a promotional session for a band in which I used some very, very wide angle lenses. And the reason for this is that the optic distortion from the wide angle lenses is what made this shot a little bit more creative than you've seen a lot of band images in. Granted, you do need a fairly specific client for this because not all people like kind of the fishbowl effect when you are capturing them, but for bands, that is one of the few subjects that you really can kind of push them out of a normal comfort zone and create something very, very unique with the equipment that you use. And once more, it doesn't take a whole lot. Just playing a little bit with a wide angle lens and playing with some of the locations that you have found that ground your subjects. This is an industrial metal band, so it only made sense to put them with lots of grays, blues, and industrial locations. As well as that, going back to the shallow depth of field lenses, this was shot with my favorite 35mm f1.2 from Sigma with Christmas lights strung up in the background. That's all that was. Because we had this idea where we wanted there to be something a little bit more in the background, but again, we didn't want to take away from the subject. So you get an idea, you find inspiration in it, and then you find a simple way to accomplish that, such as stringing up a bunch of Christmas lights on a black backdrop. It costs a grand total of $10, and you get this beautiful shot. Now, again, speaking of Christmas lighting, lighting itself is another way to elevate your photographs into a whole new realm. Lighting is one of the most fundamental principles of photography and definitely separate photographers from one another depending on how they utilize the light. And of course, there's so many different ways to tackle lighting, such as natural lighting, of course. My favorite time of day to shoot is the golden hour. I'm sure a lot of photographers here agree with that. And the benefit of the golden hour is that it really does add an unintentional bit of fantasy edge to the images, because once more, this is something that the human eye doesn't necessarily see exactly in this fashion, because a lot of the beautiful golden hour look has to do with the way that the light is hitting the glass element of the lens. But having that beautiful golden glow and just in general having your subjects glow immediately adds something more to that image. It makes it very, very visually eye-catching. And whenever I do capture natural light during the golden hour outside, for the most part, I don't use artificial lighting because I really do want that gold light to really kind of flow through that entire shot and fill the entire frame with a beautiful golden color, pushing that shot to be something that stands out from the crowd of images. I always try and imagine it as if I had a print hanging up amongst all the other prints, what's going to attract people to look at my image over somebody else's image. But likewise, when you are in the studio, there's a way to use lighting to add a more creative or fantasy edge without that lighting actually being something that looks natural. For example, these were just some light bars that I used for another band promotional session. And we wanted those light bars to actually be a part of the frame, so we just filled the whole backdrop with smoke, which kind of hid their shape just a wee little bit. And just having these little touches really pushed that shot to look like something very different. I mean, if you imagine those lights not being there, of course, it could still have a creative edge. It's still fantasy-esque because of what the subject is wearing. But adding those lights in just make it look a little bit more different from all of the other images that are quite similar. And once more, doing all of these ideas for your client, just simple little things that you can just throw into any photo shoot. You can do the entire photo shoot totally normal, the way the client wants, and then sprinkle in a few extra shots with a few extra ideas, and you'd be surprised at what that client might be navigating towards. Likewise, using lighting to set a mood is also a pretty big deal. This is a metal band that I shot a little bit earlier this year. And all we did with the lighting was hide half the face to create that mood. I mean, the face paint itself is already something that you won't normally see in a lot of client sessions. So that already elevates that shot into something that is a little bit more creative than the normal portrait. But the lighting itself is what really set that mood. And although that type of lighting is something we've seen before, I decided to add one extra rim off to the darkest side so you can still see the contour of the hair so that the subject is not lost in that very, very dark backdrop. Adding that little itty bitty element can push that shot to once more stand out from the rest who are doing a very similar type of lighting. Same with something like this, in which we only have rim lights. If you were to look at the other previous shots, you can guess that there is a fill light right up at the front, but here we took that light off the front and just did a unique contour, which creates just this silhouette, which makes once more that image look a little bit more interesting from the norm. And now for posing, because we are running out of time just a wee little bit, I want to run through some of the different ways that you can creatively pose people and add a little bit of extra into that shot. For example, most of these are band promos because that is where posing shines the most. And this was a shot in which the singer and her producer are both the same element in the music that is created, and that producer has a pretty big role in her sound. So therefore, we wanted to pose her in an interesting way where you can somewhat see that the producer is involved without taking the attention away from the singer herself. And likewise, whenever you are capturing duos of people, I love playing with levels because the awesome thing about capturing two people at once is that once more you can create very interesting compositions because you are able to add those different levels, which causes the audience's eye to travel around your frame. The big thing is to remember is that you want your audience to take in the entire image and have kind of an interaction with that image rather than landing directly on your subject and then not having anything else to do with that image. But as well, if you have groups of people, especially the dreaded group of 4 people, where it can be a little bit more difficult to compose an even number of people, my way of doing it is to always have one person generally centered and to have everything almost in a square format. So that not only for social media uploads, because that's usually the first thing we think of with squares, but to have a composition that once more spirals around your subjects and lands on each one fairly equally. So trying to keep them a little bit more in a square box is a great idea for posing, say, an even number of people. And plus, it makes those shots a little bit more interesting because it's not something that you see every day. I mean, we don't naturally sit in squares like that. So kind of pushing everybody out, getting them a little bit closer together once more creates much more interesting images. And finally, the mood of the shot is everything. You can achieve these different moods through the lighting that you utilize, the time of day that you shoot, or the editing that you do. For example, I work with a nonprofit canid conservation center in San Diego. They are called the JAB Canid Education Conservation Center, JABCECC. They have foxes, wolves, New Guinea singing dogs, coyotes, and other types of canines in their centers, all about conservation efforts and educating the public. And a few times a year, we open the center up for photo shoots there with subjects. Now, the reason that I'm bringing up this center is because I'm going to show you a series of 2 shots that were taken in the same exact place, same exact bench, same exact animals, but they look very different because of the mood that was set in those images. For example, here you can see it's kind of a princessy vibe. It's very whimsical. There's a lot of really bright colors, and there's a lot of really beautiful interaction between the model and the fox. But take a look at the next image, which was shot in the same exact place with at least the orange fox named Victor on one side being the same fox, with a completely different mood. Everything here was toned down tremendously. We used color correction to bring in a lot of those dark evergreens. And it's more if you just compare this to this, the mood is very, very different, even though we were using very similar subject matter and we were shooting in the same exact area. So don't be afraid to use a little bit of Photoshop magic to enhance the mood of the images you are creating, because sometimes it's also as simple as just changing the feel of an image to make it a little bit more interesting than it was before. So once more, thank you so much for deciding to come here for your morning and listening to me yammer on and on about something that I absolutely love. And I hope you got a little bit of ideas to make your portrait photography just a wee bit more interesting. Thank you. Over on booth 1801, I am bringing in a cosplayer, a dog, and a musician that you can come in and photograph if you would like.